Hello everybody, today we're going to go over egoism, utilitarianism, identity, and dilemma. The dilemma today is an actual case study, something that actually happened, and in class we're going to get into our groups and discuss. Throughout this lesson, if you are not coming in, there are a handful of slides where you should probably pause and answer the questions before proceeding. Because in class I would actually start asking the class questions. Engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So, up to this point in class, I've been using the terms ethics and morals interchangeably. Now, there is a decent amount of overlap, but they are not technically the same. Ethics are rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human actions or a particular group or culture, whereas morals are principles or habits with respect to right or wrong conduct. While morals also prescribe do's and don'ts, morality is ultimately a personal compass of right and wrong. What's moral to you might not necessarily be moral to everyone else, but ethics in this area is more or less the same. Now, the next is, where do they come from? Well, ethics tend to come from a social system. They're externally applied onto you, whereas morals are more individualistic. You apply it out onto society. We practice ethics because society says it is the right thing to do. We practice morals because we believe in something being right or wrong. Now, in ethics, ethics are dependent on others for definition. They tend to be consistent within a certain context, but can vary between contexts. Whereas morals are usually consistent, although can change if individuals' beliefs change. So that is to say, ethics in the US versus China versus Germany versus Africa versus India, that'll change. You should expect that to change. But within the US, well, within particular regions of the US, what's considered ethical and unethical doesn't really change that much. However, going person to person, it does change quite a bit for morals. However, your individual morals probably won't change that much over the course of 7 years. A person strictly following ethical principles may not have any morals at all. Likewise, one could violate ethical principles within a given system of rules in order to maintain moral integrity. A moral person, although perhaps bound by a higher covenant, may choose to follow a code of ethics as it would apply to a system. It would make it fit. Ethics are governed by professional and legal guidelines within a particular time and place. Morality transcends cultural norms. Now, I know we went over this a few classes ago, but it's worth repeating. There's this concept of state of nature. It's if we don't have any morals, we don't have any ethics, we don't have any rules to follow, that would be the situation we'd all be living in. Now, some people argue that social norms drive us to behave a particular way. And others argue, well, that's probably not the full picture, they don't agree at all. And so let's try to approach the problem differently. Instead of saying it's social norms, what other things could be going on to drive us to behave the way we're behaving? What's preventing us from falling into anarchy? So the first moral theory or ethical theory that you should get used to and understand is called egoism. The thing about egoism is for a period of time, each and every one of us practiced egoism pretty extensively, specifically when we were kids. Um, you know, I joke that I do think my kids are kind of empathetic, but they're still kids. They're still pretty selfish. They're only concerned about what's best for them in the short term. Um, so the theory of egoism uh, advocates that you should expect individuals to act in ways that serve their own interests. And if you expect them to behave otherwise is just basically silly. Why would you expect somebody to not want to take care of themselves? Why would you expect somebody to not be individualistic, have their own identity? Um, you should expect people to want to pursue happiness. This is all normal, but there are some criticisms to this thought process, and that's if you go to the extreme, you start disregarding the well-being of others. That is to say, you will go out of your way for it to get a minor gain to yourself at a massive cost to others around you if you go to the extreme in egoisms. If you think, hey, there are certain instances where within the right framework, egoism isn't necessarily bad, you might consider yourself what's called an ethical egoist, where it's you might even argue that it's ethical to be self-concerned as long as you try to minimize your impact on others and you act rationally and consider long-term consequences. Now think about it. If you're selfish all the time, you only care about you, what ends up happening is people around you don't want to deal with you. Well, in the discussion of self-preservation, you want people to be around you. That's a selfish need. How do you encourage people to stick around, stay around you? By treating them well. And so there's an argument that people who go out of their way to take care of others might not necessarily be doing it because they genuinely care about others. They advocate they're doing it to self-protect. They're doing it so those people will be around when they need them, not that they're doing it because they care about them. All right, so if you're watching from home, I'm going to have some questions for you that you need to answer in association with this slide. But in simple terms, a medical company donated surgical saws, typically used for cutting bones and casts, to a hospital, garnering significant attention for their generosity. It later emerged that the company received a substantial tax deduction for this donation, which became a news story. The hospital initially viewed this donation as a beneficial arrangement until they needed to replace the saw blades. Those who regularly use such saws are aware that the blades are considered consumable items and require frequent replacement. The hospital found itself in a predicament because they could only use the blades manufactured by the medical company that had made the initial donation. Unfortunately, these blades were priced significantly higher than comparable offerings from competitors in the market. Now, I want you to think about this, and I want you to write this down. Do you think the medical company was being altruistic or egotistic? That is to say, were they worried about what the hospital needed, was giving them something for free, or were they worried about something that they wanted? Was this providing the medical company more happiness down the line? Were they disregarding the needs of the hospital? Were they being unempathetic? Were they being compassionate? Were they being empathetic? Were they genuinely being charitable in the situation, or were they being manipulative? Now, it might sound strange, but in this case, I'm talking about medical devices and hospitals, but this happens with schools quite frequently, where a 3D printer might get donated, but that 3D printer only uses one type of plastic that's made by one company, and that company happens to be the guy who donated the printer. Or some companies will donate computers, but they'll have stipulations that only their software is allowed to go on that computer, and that software is not cheap. All right, this is the next case study. Again, write this down, send me an email, explain what you think. Do you think the company in this case is being altruistic or egotistical? In a remote rural village, an engineering company decided to provide clean water. Driven by altruism, they imposed a sophisticated water purification system without consulting the community. As time passed, it became clear that the community couldn't maintain the complex technology independently. The company offered costly maintenance services and introduced exclusive consumables. The company used this project for self-promotion, showcasing their altruism to win contracts and bolster their image. Now, in this case, what is the company doing? Are they genuinely being altruistic here? Or are they being manipulative? Or are they being paternal? Are they showing true empathy here? Are their motives actually clear? Was their end goal here just to provide some cheap, clean water? Or were they being selfish? Were they ignoring how their actions were going to negatively affect the community? I want you to write up what you think is actually happening here and explain it to me. All right. I hope you like my photography skills. These are two tenants that live in my yard. My wife and I and my kids, we all have an affinity towards animals. I think especially my wife and my son have a particularly good skill at attracting animals. My daughter and I are more like Elmira, where we want to pet and touch everything. But Sarah and Teddy are pretty good at getting things to come to them. Somehow, Teddy was able to get this hawk to come by. Now, because of this, we tend to have certain personality types gravitate towards us, specifically vegans. They think that since we're so good with animals, that we would never eat them. So this brings me to my favorite joke. How do you identify a vegan at a party? Well, you don't have to. They'll let you know by themselves, even if there's no obvious segue. Now, looking at me, you can tell I'm not a vegan. I'm too big. You don't get to my size without eating some meat. But I do have these animals in my yard. Now, one big complaint I've heard about vegans is their version of altruism comes across offensively. Now, I don't have any qualms with anyone's diet. If you can't stomach the idea of killing an animal, I totally understand. However, when talking to a lot of vegans, when the way they project themselves is that they're suggesting that they're from a higher level of altruism than the ordinary person. However, this comes across as being a bit disingenuous, almost paternalistic, like they're telling you they know what altruistic is, and they know what's best for everyone involved, including the animals. Now, both of these animals live in my yard. Without killing them, I can't make them go away. So, my neighbors have chicken coops. When I say neighbors, I mean the neighbors south of me have a chicken coop, and the neighbors east of me have a chicken coop. And it's a symbiotic relationship. The chickens provide eggs, and the neighbor provides the coop, they provide food, they provide shelter from these particular creatures, they provide warmth, and they make sure that the chickens never get sick. Well, not never, but they have veterinarians come by and take care of them. Now, I've had vegans come over and suggest that my neighbors should just let the chickens go free. Do you think the chickens going free and dealing with red here would be beneficial for them? Do you think their overall life would be better by dealing with these two tenants than dealing with my neighbors? Now, it's subjective. That's the point. That's one thing I'm trying to get across here. That is subjective. But generally speaking, most people would say the life of those chickens is broadly improved versus being let go free by having a symbiotic relationship with my neighbors. Now, we talked about egoism, we talked about altruism, now we're going to talk about utilitarianism. Now, in egoism, whether you're being an ethical egoist and you're thinking about how your actions will affect people long term, and you do your best to come across as altruistic even though ultimately you're selfish, or you're just plain old regular old egoist and you're very clearly selfish. But what if instead of doing that, your focus was instead on the group? You know that being particularly selfish is going to have negative side effects, but you know if you always work towards making the group better, even though it might not directly give you upfront gains, it might give you gains long term, and you'd rather have that, you might be considered utilitarianism. Now, utilitarians have this idea called the greatest happiness principle. This says you need to go out of your way to maximize the amount of good in the world while simultaneously minimizing the amount of bad in the world. And by doing this, you're going to optimize the happiness. And from a utilitarian standpoint, it doesn't matter how you do that. What matters is that you do that. And so if the means to you maximizing or optimizing happiness is mean or selfish or rude, it doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. Some people might consider this the saying, the ends justify the means. Whatever the means are, the method of getting you there, it's justified as long as it leads you to the optimum happiness. So we're going to do some thought experiments to reinforce what we're talking about here. So don't be so serious. Should Batman kill the Joker? We know Batman won't kill the Joker. He's got some moral code telling him not to. We know the Joker will kill repeatedly. He's killed people in the past. He's open about how he's going to kill people in the future. If Batman gets the opportunity to kill the Joker, but instead of executing on the task, lets him go free or lets him go to jail knowing he'll eventually get out, does that make Batman partially culpable, partially guilty of all of the Joker's future crimes? That is to say, if you could have prevented something bad and you chose not to, are you partially responsible for it? So, thought experiment 1. It's your birthday. Family says you get to choose the restaurant. You want to go to the Muse. Everybody else wants to go to the Ocean Mist. What do? So, if you're an egoist, what you want is to go to the Muse. You don't really care what everybody thinks about. If you're an altruist, your opinion gets omitted from the decision-making process because everybody else wants to go to the Ocean Mist and that makes them happy. However, if you're a utilitarian, it's a little more complicated. You actually have to assess how much more happiness are you going to get by going to the Muse? Is your family going to have no happiness or just less happiness? Are you going to have no happiness going to the Ocean Mist? Maybe it's cold outside, and that's your justification for not wanting to go. So you actually have to do that weighing, and then you make the decision. Now, again, all of that's subjective. How much happiness are you going to get? It's really hard to quantify. How much happiness are they going to get? That's also hard to quantify. Some people like to boil it down to money somehow. Some people like to boil it down to other quantifiable things. It tends to be money, though. But I want you to answer this directly. What would you do? And granted, I'm trying to be a little silly here. I'm saying the Muse and the Ocean Mist. I want you to think of an actual example that you might have actually run into. What's something you like to do on your birthday? Have you been in a situation where somebody said, no, let's do something else, and you capitulated because you wanted to make the group happy? All right, thought experiment 2. You're a utilitarian. Someone has shown you they have 20 people in the chamber. They're going to kill all 20. If you personally kill one of them, they'll let the other 19 go. Now, in this example, you have to watch the person die. What do you do? From your point of view, your morals, I want to know. Would you be responsible for that one person's death? They're going to die either way. Are you responsible for that death now? If you choose not to kill them, are you responsible for the other 19 deaths? Do you think I'm not going to test this in class, this is a thought experiment, but do you think if you were actually presented with this problem that you'd follow through with it? What piece of information would you need to know to say, I definitely will or I definitely won't? All right. Now, I need to make a point here. Inaction is an option. A lot of people think that by ignoring a problem, stepping away from it, looking the other way, that somehow washes their hands of any involvement. And that's just not true. The world is filled with challenges and injustices. Just because you ignore them doesn't mean they're not there. Utilitarianism requires that you maximize the good and minimize the bad as best you can. So if you're given the option to, and you don't, you're being immoral. Sometimes, unfortunately, this requires you to make difficult decisions and getting your hands dirty. Choosing inaction in the face of opportunity can be as culpable as the negative outcome that ensues. So, for example, in the case of Batman versus Joker, should Batman have ended the Joker to prevent further harm? According to utilitarianism, he should have. Our choices, be they actions or inactions, shape the world. Ethical considerations must guide these decisions, weighing the greatest good against moral costs. I want you to remember, when you choose inaction, your friends are much more willing or much more likely to remember the things you didn't do and didn't say than all of the terrible things that happened. All right. Now, if you think you're a utilitarian, but looking at that case with the 19 people, you definitely haven't thought, but I wouldn't do that. This slide might be important for you. So an act utilitarian or a classical utilitarian will just do the upfront analysis, execute on a decision. Whatever is going to cause the greatest happiness, the least sadness, that's what you do. However, there's another type of utilitarian called rule utilitarian. And they have a set of rules, and it's not a guaranteed rule. That is to say, it's not the same from person to person, but you have a set of rules that you know you most likely will never do. And being asked to do those things, even if they did cause the greatest happiness, would be breaking that rule and therefore be immoral. Now, there are some rules that people generally accept, like don't kill anybody, but there are some rules that are specific to you, and they're subjective. There's a tendency that the rule utilitarians have a better long-term view. They're more manageable, more predictable. They don't burn bridges as often because they do have a set of rules that they're going to follow, whereas an act utilitarian will absolutely burn a bridge if they think it's what's best for them. There's more moral consistency with the rule utilitarians. There is a big critique of rule utilitarians that sometimes if they too strictly adhere to the rules, they're not really utilitarians. And at that point, what's the point of being utilitarian? Sometimes rule utilitarians pretend the rules don't exist and act as act utilitarians because that's what's best for them. Generally speaking, rule utilitarianism is what's used to make laws. All right. Again, if you are at home, you have to answer this. You're a utilitarian surgeon. You have 5 patients on the transplant list for different organs. All of the patients will die soon without a transplant. Your neighbor sucks and can donate to all 5. Killing your neighbor and donating his organs will save the 5 patients. What would you do? Now think about this. Maybe you already know that you're an act utilitarian, or maybe you already know you're a rule utilitarian. If you're an act utilitarian, what do you think the surgeon should do? If you're a rule utilitarian, what do you think the surgeon should do? If the surgeon chooses to kill his neighbor, is it immoral? Based off of act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Is it moral to let the 5 patients die if you're an act utilitarian or a rule utilitarian? All right, so now we're going to discuss identity, and then we're going to assess the dilemma, okay? Okay, so big important detail about being an engineer. You need to be impartial, and you need to reason through problems. Now, reasoning is required to be moral. Reasoning is crucial in making moral choices. It involves critical thinking and objective analysis, moving beyond mere personal preferences, such as those in food, to more substantial moral judgments. While emotions are part of the human experience, relying solely on them can cloud judgment. Moral reasoning requires an objective approach where decisions are not swayed by personal feelings, but are based on rational evaluations. Impartiality in ethics means treating all individuals as equally deserving of consideration. No one is inherently special or inferior. All judgments and decisions should be based on reason and fair evaluation, not on personal bias or prejudice. Ethical conduct requires an effort to guide one's actions and decisions by reason, where one seeks to be logical and coherent in moral judgment. It involves a thorough examination of facts and implications of one's actions. This process includes considering the consequences and the impacts of all involved parties. Being open to rational argument and willing to listen to reason are key aspects. It involves being willing to change one's views if reason and evidence suggests one should. Quick statement, a little beyond the slide in the class. If you know you're dealing with somebody who's already made up their mind, don't waste your breath talking to them. Just move on. While emotions are integral to the human experience, ethical and moral decisions make While emotions are integral to the human experience, ethical and moral decision making requires a balance, where reason takes precedence, ensuring fairness, objectivity, and impartiality in our judgments and actions. Now, I want you to think for a minute. I want you to look around the room. I want you to think about your friends in engineering. How many of them, when you first met them, told you what their major was? That they were going to be a mechanical engineer, an electrical engineer. And I want you to think about those same people and when they told you where they were from, whether they told you they were locals, whether they were from Jersey, whether they were international. Where in that discussion order was, let's talk about what a profession actually is. Now, there's a textbook definition of what a career and a profession is. I don't really want to go that route. I'd rather talk about characteristics that are common to a profession. The first one is extensive and demanding training. Some of you might like to brag and say, engineering's easy, but I remember taking these classes and they were not. They were very difficult, and I'll be honest with you, when I would describe what I was doing, what I was studying, what I had to do to graduate to people who are not engineers, who are not in the STEM majors, it was a lot, and they said it was a lot. The next is you are heavily regulated by states or territories. You're going to be. Now, there's the direct regulations and there's the indirect regulations. So the direct ones are if you want a FE, EIT, or PE, you are going to be regulated. This is very direct. You have to know all of the laws yourself. But to be successful within engineering, without a PE or an FE, you still need to know and practice and abide by all of the regulations. You might need to learn what your industry-specific regulations are, but you still need to follow them. There's going to be some apprenticeship and mentoring. For the first 3 to 5 years of your job, you're going to have somebody watching you. And not because, they don't trust you or they think you're a bad person or anything like that. No, it's what you're doing is specialized compared to the average job. So they need somebody with you all of the time, guiding you on the best way to do it. The next is there's an expectation of continuing education. It is very common for engineers to come back and get second or third degrees. Sometimes it's an MBA and you just become better at managing money and people. Sometimes it's a much more focused degree in terms of what you're working on or what you'd rather be working on. And a lot of times, and this is true for my wife, you end up having to get some kind of certification every year or so in something new so that way you stay competitive. Now, I don't know where you guys are in life, but I know personally, I've had neighbors, friends, and family come to me with a technical problem. Something about their house was broken, their car is not starting, they don't know how to fix something, and they just assume I know. I mean, sometimes I do, but a lot of times I don't. And that's because the general public just kind of expects you to know a lot. And so there is an expectation that your skills are valuable to the community. There's autonomy in the workplace. Now, I realize I just said you're going to be apprentice and somebody's going to be with you all the time and helping you, but that's going to be like you're going to see your boss in the morning once or twice a week, and you're going to tell him, this is my plan, this is what I'm doing, this is how I plan to execute everything, and yeah, they'll talk to you and walk you through what they think you should be doing. But once that discussion's over, it's all you. You got to figure out the rest. I can almost guarantee you a lot of your friends are not taking an ethics class in their degree because they don't have to. Now, part of the reason you have to take this ethics class is because making very human mistakes in engineering can get people killed. Pipelines fail, buildings fall down, cars crash. And so the expectation is when those failures occur, they are 100% technical problems and not because you decided to be lazy. Now, you can choose which code of ethics you'd like to stick with. I use the NSPE, but there is one specific to mechanical engineers, there is one specific to industrial engineers, chemical engineers, electrical engineers, whatever you want to focus on. I mean, you have to make an educated guess as to what and why, but you're going to have an actual set of code of conduct for your degree. How much trust we get from the public compared to other professions. And we really need that trust because that gives us a very high level of autonomy compared to other professions. And it would take us forever to get anything done if we didn't have this autonomy, to the point that we'd practically be useless without it. Now, there's reasons for this. First off is the public does not understand engineering principles. The engineers in general will end up asking a lot of questions, and not because we don't trust other people or anything crazy like that. It's just because we're naturally inquisitive. And so when somebody gives us something, recommends something in a professional setting, we're very likely to say things like, how is that measured? How do you know that? Can I repeat it? Is it possible for me to do? Can I just do it myself? What's involved with taking care of that? If I bought that thing and I tried to implement it, what extra work are you not describing because you think it's menial will I have to do? Will I be able to do that stuff? If I proceed with the tool you're recommending and I put it to a stress test, will it survive? If it survives up to that point and I actually make it work with the rest of my tools, will it break one of my other tools? Does it make sense for me to buy it if I know I have to replace other things? And lastly, how do you implement something? These are all questions that it's very common for engineers just to come up with on the fly when somebody proposes something. And not because they're trying to be a pain or because they're trying to call somebody a liar or anything crazy like that. It's just natural. And engineers tend to do what's called the 5 whys. Simply put, you just keep asking why until you are satisfied that you have enough information to make an intelligent decision. A lot of people feel that this is interrogations, and to a certain extent, depending on what's going on, it might be an interrogation. But the general public doesn't do any of this, and they can't do a lot of this, and they feel uncomfortable not knowing. Now, granted, engineers also don't feel comfortable not knowing, but their solution to that problem is much different. The general public will walk away ignoring the fact that they don't know. Engineers will keep saying why, until they know why. And they feel that they also fully comprehend what's going on. And because of this, the public puts a lot of faith in us. And they trust us just to build things right for them, to make sure the systems are safe, that the things do what they're designed to do. And so there is an expectation that we will hold the safety, health, and welfare of the public paramount. So I need to address some ambiguity in the term welfare. Um, I'm not particularly fond of it, especially when used in codes, because it's intentionally ambiguous. And what they're referring to is quality of life and well-being, which, again, is a subjective term. Health and safety is quantifiable. You can point to something and say you are reducing the safety here, you're reducing health here. Well-being and quality of life is a bit subjective. And so I'm doing my best here to provide more objective ways of measuring it. But again, there's still subjectivity in them. So things that improve welfare is positive emotions, enjoyment of activities, connection to something, accomplishments, positive relationships. You can rephrase these as being loved, having fun, emotional connections, getting things done, getting along. And these are all good. But in simple terms, at least to me, what welfare really means is happiness. You're trying to maximize happiness. And the way you do that is you optimize enjoyment and you minimize sadness or depression or stress. And again, I tried finding a subset of how do we define stress and things like that. Not super clear, and it's very subjective. I know there's things that make me upset, but not necessarily stressed out. That I know a handful of the people, if I did something that would normally make me upset, but not stressed out, would make them very stressed out. So I don't want to go into specifics on that because just the level of subjectivity here is huge. But in simple terms, it's maximizing happiness. Now, when we talk about the NSPE codes, so I did go over utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. As an engineer, these are some real rules you really should be following to the best of your ability. Some of these are, if you don't follow them, you'll ruin your career. Some of you will lose your career, and some of you will go to jail. So the first is revealing secrets. Depending on who you work for, the level of severity there is very wide. So I signed an agreement with the Navy that I wouldn't reveal what I know for 80 years. I'm not really too worried about accidentally sharing what I know. The worst that would probably happen to me is I wouldn't be allowed to see those secrets anymore, but there are secrets that if you revealed them, going to jail would be nice compared to what they would actually do. If you're working for a company and you reveal secrets, you better be prepped to leave the industry altogether, because nobody's going to want to hire you afterwards because they can't share information with you once they see that you're willing to share secrets. The next is associate with the dishonest. So I know I've said this once already, it bears repeating. You want to work in an environment where you are able to sharpen your skills and you can focus on the tasks at hand and make sure that you do the best job possible. So one of the things you have to be in that environment is to not worry about where your next paycheck's coming from, if the company's going to make money, if you're going to get in trouble because of somebody else's actions. And if people see that you are associating with the dishonest, they're going to start having those thoughts. Am I going to get in trouble by associating with this guy who's associating with the dishonest? And if the answer is yes, they're going to start taking defensive actions. They're going to self-protect, and they might even go out of their way to get you removed. And I'll be honest with you, that's probably the right decision for them. So you shouldn't be surprised that they're going to do that. Next is aid in unlawful practices. This is worse than associating with dishonest. This means being dishonest. So if you get asked to stamp something, and you have a PE, and you know the thing you're stamping is either something you don't have expertise in, or you know is wrong, that's illegal. You're aiding an unlawful practice. If you know you're working with construction workers and they choose to not follow a lot of the safety rules, that's aiding unlawful practices. Next is double billing. Now, there's some debate as to what the formal definition is here. The one I like to use, because this is the one I've seen happen, I've seen somebody get in trouble for it, is, let's say you were working for the Department of Defense, and the Air Force would really like you to do some study. They want you to put some airplane in a wind tunnel, and they want to know the aerodynamic drag associated with that airplane. Let's say that airplane's the F-35. And then the Air Force and the Navy come along and say, hey, we know you have a wind tunnel over there. If we gave you an F-35, could you run this study on it? Well, the thing is, the F-35 is not all that different between the Air Force variant, the Navy variant, and the Army variant. And so if you were that defense contractor with that wind tunnel, you would have to make it known to the Army, Air Force, and the Navy that all three of them are asking for the same thing. And you'd have to go to the Army and say, hey, because you're the first one to ask, I'm still going to charge you full price, but do you mind if I share what I find with the Navy and the Air Force? That at least gives the Army an opportunity to say to the Air Force and the Navy, hey, there should be some cost sharing here. And so if you did that study 3 times, even though you know for a fact the results are going to be the same, you have to share the results without doing the study. There are special exemptions from this, especially when you're trying to keep things secret. But another case I ran into was, I worked for a company that did feasibility studies. They wanted to know if they built a compressor station in this particular spot, how much was it going to cost them over the course of 7 years. And so we did it out. We counted how many bolts and how many compressors they would need, and what construction crews were actually in the area, and how much those construction crews actually charge. And we went through the whole gamut of an estimate, and we gave them an estimate of this is how much it's going to cost you if you build that in that general area. And then their competitor came to us and said, hey, we want you to tell us if we put a compressor station in that exact spot, how much it's going to cost us. Well, what we're not allowed to do is go to either of the companies and say, you're trying to do the same thing. We're not allowed to do that. But what we are allowed to do is say, instead of charging the full price to do the study, we would charge a part of the price. Basically the cost of going through, swapping out the names of the companies on everything, and then handing it to them. The next is you can't issue yourself government contracts. And this also applies if it looks like. It doesn't actually have to happen. It just has to look like it might be happening. This one's pretty straightforward. There have been special cases where a government employee will be asked to write a submittal or a proposal to a project, and per regulations, they'll recuse themselves during the assessment portion of the project. But unfortunately, that's close enough to it looking like you issued yourself the contract, because if you know the other reviewers, you might be able to talk them into being like, hey, we're friends, can you give me a break here? And it looks like you're giving yourself a contract in that situation. The next is falsifying qualifications. This is pretty straightforward. Saying you're good at something and you're not. If you're a mechanical engineer, stick to the mechanics. Don't talk about the electronics unless you have to. Vice versa. Don't have any conflicts of interest. This one tends to be, again, pretty straightforward, but still, it's still a career ender. The easiest thing to do is just acknowledge that you have a conflict of interest. So I wasn't allowed to own stock in any individual defense contractor. I was allowed to own the ETFs and mutual funds for defense contractors, but I wasn't allowed to own the defense contractor stock itself. And so whenever I would do a contract review, and that was one of the things I did the most, I would have to state all of my investments. So that way it doesn't even look like I have a conflict of interest. And I can't tell you how many times I had to tell the Navy that the company my wife worked for didn't make weapons. Then one day she switched companies, and I honestly didn't know whether they made weapons or not, and I wasn't really going to argue with them. I was just going to do the paperwork. And they came back, and her company did make weapons. It made a special type of body armor. And so I was never going to be on one of those contracts, but the Navy was very clear that had I said there was no relation, it would look like there was a conflict of interest, but being that I was openly like, I don't know, they looked the other way. The last is participating in slander. So you're not allowed to call another company crummy or crappy, but what you are allowed to say is that company charges twice as much for the same service. That company built something that fell down, and we built the same thing and it's still standing. You're allowed to use objective terms to make your case that you're better, but it has to be objective. All right, so now we're going to spend some time talking about an actual case. What we're going to talk about actually happened. TV antenna towers, Senior Road, Missouri City, Texas. So we still have these antenna towers. There's one north of URI. If you go to the top of Fazatelli, you can see it. These are very large structures, large in terms of very tall. They're, relatively speaking, pretty skinny. They're built in sections, about 40-foot sections. Every 40 feet or so, they install what's called a guy wire. Not guide, guy wire. And these guy wires make it so the structure doesn't shake too much. Make sure the structure stays in place. Without one of these guy wires, the resonance would cause the structure to fall. At the base of these towers, you'll see these structures basically holding the tower in place. base of most of these towers, you have a utility building. So that provides the electricity to the tower. If you need to send signal from the tower, the signal goes to this building first and converts it to whatever signal the tower needs. Also vice versa, if the tower is receiving signal, the signal goes to here first, that gets converted into something that's consumable by the local stations, and then that gets transported over wires. Usually there's like a bathroom in here for people to hang out. I mean, a place to hang out and like a bathroom so people can actually work there for 40 hours a week. In our particular case, one of the companies we're going to refer to as the antenna company was the antenna design company, or the antenna engineers. And they were paid to design the antenna. And then there was another company, the riggers. Need to be clear, these are not their real names. I've changed them, but by all means, feel free to look them up. The antenna was built in 40-foot sections. That is to say, in New Jersey somewhere, they would build 40-foot sections of this antenna, and they'd ship it from New Jersey to Texas. Once they got to Texas, they'd be lifted off the back of the truck, and then they'd be carried up to the top of the tower. The current plan was to lift it horizontally. Once they got it off the truck, they'd adjust it so it was vertical, and once it was vertical, they'd lift it straight up. So this particular tower is supposed to be 1,800 feet tall. At about 1,000 feet, they ran into an issue. Two of the sections that got delivered had a new feature that was different from the last one. The lifting lugs no longer fit onto the antenna, and there's a risk of damaging the antenna. The riggers requested permission to modify the sections and fix it later. I'm going to stop there and discuss what that actually means in a professional environment. Fix it later. If you are working with a supplier, construction team, any major laborer, if they want to proceed and fix something later, that means they want to proceed and not do that thing ever. Fixing it later means it never gets done. They try to sugarcoat it and make it look like they intend to fix it, but it always ends up being something that they feel doesn't really need to happen, but they still expect to get paid in full. Engineers didn't like that answer, so they said, no, you have to leave it where it is. Because they knew if it got removed, it was never going to get reattached. And there's a good chance the feature that was there was the real reason the tower was being put up in the first place. So the riggers modified the lifting method against the engineer's recommendation. At this point, the engineers ended communication with the riggers. Now, on the left was how they had been lifting the bolts or the tower before. The bolts were experiencing a vertical force, pulling it straight up. And what the riggers decided to do was put the tower at a 30-degree angle and lift like that. This increased the actual stress on the bolt. By how much? It's unclear. Sure, you are welcome to do the math and figure it out. This is an ethics class. What's important here is that there was a change that was unapproved. So now we need to assess. Is there a technical reason why the riggers shouldn't have changed the way they lifted the antenna? I'm not going to answer these. If you are watching this video, you are watching it from home, and I am expecting you to answer that question and email me. Do you think the riggers were professional when they asked to make the modifications? That is to say, do you think they said, would you guys mind if we made this modification? Or do you think they were incredibly rude? Do you think the riggers were following state and federal codes up to that point? Do you think the riggers had complied with drawings up to that point? Do you think the riggers were listening to reason when discussing with the engineers? Do you think the engineers were in the process of contacting the riggers' superiors? Do you think the engineers were emotionally spent by the time the riggers decided to change the lift method? So, answer those questions, but I need to tell you something about my personal experience when I was working construction. I was a field engineer. It was my job to redline modifications to the design. That was my only job, and that was the only thing I could do. I couldn't approve modifications. I had to go through my boss for that. And one of the things I did before I went to the site was my company had purchased what probably came to about 2 miles worth of pipe of various diameters. And I took a photo of every pipe. And I showed in said photos that every pipe was straight. And I thought this was a really dumb, tedious task that my boss gave me. And it turned out not to be. When I got to the construction site, I saw that one of the pipes had been bent. Now, in construction, there is a tool and a method for bending pipes at various angles. However, it's a very specific way to do it. And if you don't do it that way, there's a really good chance you will destroy the integrity of the pipe. That is to say, if you actually put it under pressure, it would fail. So I saw that the pipe was bent, and I took photos of it, and I saw a whole bunch of fatigue marks on it that, had they bent it correctly, wouldn't have been there. And I showed the foreman. The foreman was not happy. The foreman said that I had bent it while I was up there. Now, I found out later what actually happened was, instead of getting a forklift and picking up the 2 miles of pipe off of the back of the truck, keep in mind they had a forklift, they just had a guy get up on top of the truck and start throwing the pipes. And the larger pipes, this wasn't a problem because they were so big. But this particular pipe had a diameter of about my thumb and wasn't strong enough to absorb the load when it hit the ground, and it just bent. But because of this, I had to document that it was damaged, that we couldn't use that particular section of pipe. And at that point, my supervisor more or less said, we're not paying to replace that. You guys broke that. You need to fix it. Foreman didn't like that answer, but the foreman couldn't fight it. Now, it's common when you have many, many drawings to have, at the beginning of the mechanical section, one drawing that says, all drawings must comply with the following set of codes. And that's where the P stamp actually goes. So, one of the requirements was, for compressor stations, you must pressure test all pipes to 1.5 times their failure pressure, not their operating pressure, their failure pressure. So, one of the sets of pipes had a particularly high failure pressure, and the only company that was willing to drive to Bangor, Maine was in southern New Jersey, and they were not going to pressure test for cheap. They were going to charge a lot of money, because this particular test is inherently dangerous. And so the construction company didn't want to do it. And they kept making excuse after excuse why they didn't want to do it. And one of the things they kept going back to was they had a ton of welders, and those welders had never seen this requirement before, so they didn't believe it was real, and that we were making it up. But the thing is, it wasn't like we just arbitrarily made this rule. On the drawing, it said, per ASME code, the pressure test shall be done. And this went on for a while. And the engineering firm that I worked for said, you can do whatever you want. RPE stamp only applies if you do that test. And finally, one day, they refused in front of the construction company's set of managers. And my company had to basically say to them, we're going to take away our stamp because we're legally allowed to do that if you refuse to do what's on the drawing. And the thing is, engineers could do that for any little change if they want to. And this was a big change that they were trying to push. It was a safety issue. And the only way we were able to get the construction workers to accept that they had to do it was by going to their bosses and saying, you have to do it. You don't have an option here. So Foreman really didn't like that answer because at that point, instead of going to him, we went to his boss. Now, there was a design feature about this compressor station that looked funny. Because of the way the codes are written, we had to install what looked like a smokestack. It wasn't a smokestack. It looked like a smokestack, though. And the entire team of construction workers kept saying, it's a smokestack, it's a smokestack, and we kept having to explain to them, it's not a smokestack. But what it was a vertical 32-inch pipe that was 20 feet tall. And it complied with all the ASME and state and federal requirements for the emergency relief system. And I don't want to get into the engineering of it too much, but the way we had designed it was within the legal requirements, but if you made any modifications to it, you would leave the legal requirements really fast. And so what the construction workers decided to do was add another 20-foot section of 32-inch pipe on top of it. So that way it looked like a real smokestack. Now this caused two problems. The first one was the safety relief system didn't meet the code anymore. I'm not going to get into the engineering, just trust me, it didn't meet the code anymore. The second problem was they didn't change the guy wire system. They used the original one that we had designed for a 20-foot stack. And per civil engineering, structural stuff beyond my capability, you want to design things to last 100 years. Well, by adding this second length of pipe on top of it, it went from being a 100-year structure to a month structure. One good gust of wind would destroy the smokestack. And in the section of Maine we were in, they were prone to what's called a microburst. Not only that, storm season was coming, and they knew that they were going to get hit by microbursts. And so the structural company that designed the system called us and said, we need to remove the stamp now. That structure is going to fall down in the next 90 days. We don't know exactly what day, but we know it will fall down. And at this point, my boss called the foreman, totally bypassed me, calls the foreman and says, you need to fix that. You have to take it down. And the foreman told Larry to go fuck off and that he was an idiot and he didn't know what he was talking about and he was going to go to the rest of the project. It wasn't his problem anymore. So Larry, even though internally I knew Larry wanted the smokestack to fall down and destroy the site, he knew he'd get in trouble if he let that happen. So he did two things. The first thing he did was call the safety department in Bangor and told them what had just happened. And keep in mind, this structure was it stuck out. Number one. Number two, he called the foreman's boss and explained to the foreman what had just happened and how much danger had just been manufactured. Construction team did not like this because the foreman's boss called him and said, you have X amount of time to take it down. And my understanding was, I'm going to pay you overtime to fix it, was not the conversation. It was, you're going to fix it or I'm going to fire you. This is a genuine safety hazard. Do not do this again. So they fixed it. Now, I don't have it written here, but then there was this X-ray drama. You don't know, when you weld something, you have to X-ray it, and you have to check to see how good the weld is. And if you see any imperfections, you're not allowed to pressure test it, because the imperfections suggest that the weld will fail under extreme loads. In propane systems and in methane systems, you have to 100% X-ray every weld. This is a carryover from the 1910s. Realistically, we don't need this rule anymore, but it is a federal rule and you can't get rid of it. The foreman really did not like this rule because that meant he had to pay for good welders for all of the welds, and he didn't want to do that because that's expensive. So what he did is the entire time he kept arguing in steam systems, you only randomly test 10% of the welds, which is true. You're allowed to do that in steam systems. This isn't a steam system. And so he kept advocating, and the X-ray team shows up. And the X-ray team is a set of contractors. The X-ray team says to the foreman, we know what the rules are. We will randomly test 10% up front for you if you want us to do that, but we have to test all of them. So the foreman gave them a list of 10 random welds to check. Now the thing is, I looked at the list and I knew who had welded them. It was the guy who was being paid the most to be welding there. He was the one who actually knew what he was doing. And so the X-ray team did that, sent it in, everything was fine. But the X-ray team kept going because that was their job. And I went and talked to the X-ray team the next day, and they said, you work for the engineering company, it's your job to keep track of this stuff, and they handed me the thumb drive with all of the X-rays on it. So I send the X-rays to my boss, and we had a meeting. It was my boss, me, the foreman, the foreman's boss, and a bunch of other high-ranking people on this project. And so the foreman's boss asks directly, how are the X-rays going? What do the welds look like? And the foreman said something to the effect of, all of the welds I've seen have been great, which was true. He had cherry-picked which ones he wanted to see. And then my boss asked, what's the actual failure rate? And this is one of those things where failure rates are expected. The chances that none of them failed, especially when there's more than 10 welds overall, is practically zero. So, of course, the foreman said, there's no failures, everything's perfect. And then my boss said, I've looked at all of the X-rays. I can tell you there are a handful of failures. Now, what's normal is like 5% fail. In this case, it was close to half. Now, everything about these codes is chance. The chance of the pressure test causing a problem is a function of how many X-rays fail. And my boss just said, based off of the number of failed X-rays, the chance that this pipeline is going to explode when you pressurize it is practically 100%. And at that point, the foreman started arguing about this, that, and the other thing, and how my boss knew. And my boss didn't feel like arguing. He just mailed the X-rays to the foreman's boss. At this point, the foreman's boss says to the foreman, look, you're clearly screwing around. You built a smokestack when you weren't supposed to. You've been arguing this pressure test, which is a federal requirement. You're destroying pipes and just screwing around. I don't want another complaint or I'm firing you. So, of course, this is somehow my fault. And the foreman freaks out on me, screaming and yelling, calling me an idiot, calling me an asshole. But whatever. I get over it. Finally, we get towards the end of the project, and they install this pipe, and the pipe's supposed to be on a set of T's, and the T's are supposed to be in a straight line, and I can see one of the T's is bending over, and it is not in line with the other T's. And I say it. I say I can see that T is out of place. Something's wrong with it. And they started arguing with me about the definition of the straight line, how I could possibly know that that was straight. So I went and got a string, and I tied a string around the T's. And had the T's been straight, the string would have touched every T. But instead, there was a big gap. And I pointed at it. Now, leaving it like this is a safety hazard. It can cause problems. It's not nearly as bad as the X-rays and the pressure test, but it's not good. And again, the foreman freaked out. And at this point, I stopped caring. I just stopped caring, and I quit, because it became clear that the foreman was just screwing around and had no business managing this site. So now we're going to watch the video. I want you to think about the story I just told you, and I want you to know that's normal for that kind of environment.
On December 7th, 1982, in Missouri City, Texas, construction on an 1,800-foot television tower is nearing completion. As the workers prepare to place the final antennas on the top of the tower, one of the engineers involved begins to videotape the final stages of construction. Suddenly, disaster strikes as a U-bolt in the pulley system used to raise the antenna fails and causes the antenna to fall. If you look closely, you can see some of the construction workers falling with the antenna. On its way down, the antenna broke two guy wires used for stability, and soon the entire tower came crashing down in less than 17 seconds. As the tower begins collapsing, the cameraman drops his camera and makes a run for cover. 3 men riding the antenna to the top, and 2 men on the tower at the time of its collapse were all killed. 3 other workers were injured after jumping off the second-story roof of a nearby building that was crushed by the collapsing tower.
So this is the microwave basket that we were talking about. One of the things you need to understand here is the engineers were emotionally spent. I can guarantee you every day, that construction crew had a new problem that they had manufactured that they wanted the engineering team to fix. And this was probably the last straw. Whether the engineering company or not was talking to their supervisors or not, doesn't really matter. The engineers chose to do nothing. They chose an ineffectual path to fix a problem that allowed a handful of people to die. It's your job to make sure things like this doesn't happen. So you need to maintain your mental health at work. And if you find that the teams you're working with are causing these problems regularly, you either need to separate yourself from them or have them separated from you. So the final analysis on the failure event was during the final construction of the 1,800-foot tower, the rigging system failed. The final section fell to the ground, cutting through 2 guy wires, which then caused the structure to lose integrity and fall over. 5 of the workers, 2 being lifted and 3 on the tower, all died immediately. It was determined that the new lifting method was the overall problem because it wasn't strong enough to lift the antenna. If you are at home, I need you to answer all of these questions. If you're at home, I need you to answer all of these questions as well.